I discuss about the general consideration of the autonomic nervous system in this class. If you go back to my earlier slides, I mentioned the functions of the spinal cord. I categorized them as sensory functions, the motor functions, and the reflex functions, and autonomic functions. I have covered the reflex functions in my previous lectures. Today I am focusing on the autonomic functions. Today's plan is first to see what this autonomic nervous system is. That is the first question, followed by the various parts of autonomic nervous system and functions of autonomic nervous system in general. And third, I look into the organizational aspects of the autonomic nervous system in terms of the sympathetic division, in terms of the parasympathetic division, in terms of the enteric system. I summarize and I give some assignments in the end. What is autonomic nervous system? Autonomic nervous system, it is a part of the nervous system. So that means the central nervous system is divided into somatic nervous system and autonomic nervous system. And autonomic system is responsible for the homeostatic regulations of the body. And these homeostatic regulations, which are essential for the bodily functions, for maintaining the internal environment to the changes happening internally as well as externally. The autonomic nervous system, it acts largely unconsciously. That means it is not governed by the conscious activity. And it's applied to all organs of the body, especially the efferent component is projected to every organ and every cellular system in the body, whereas somatomotor system is only to the skeletal muscle. So that means the efferents reaching to the somatomotor, the body muscles, is only to the skeletal muscles. Although we may think that survival will not be possible without the autonomic nervous system, but it is not true. The people may survive. People will survive in the absence of autonomic nervous system, but the quality of life is affected. That means the regulation of the system is grossly affected, and because of the lack of regulation, he may succumb to some complications. That is the main thing. This is about ANS. Broadly, we consider what are the major functions of ANS. As I mentioned, the autonomic nervous system is responsible for homeostatic regulations at unconscious level that are brought about by changes in internal and external stimuli. The homeostatic regulations include, the first thing is thermoregulation, the fight and flight response, so that means response to emergency calls, the blood pressure regulation, carbohydrate, protein, fat metabolism. So that means homeostatic regulation of the metabolism in general, especially the carbohydrates, the glucose metabolism is greatly affected. It will affect the functioning of the smooth muscles of the body, either present in blood vessels or in the intestinal wall or gut wall or in the urinary bladder or in the ureter, wherever they are. It affects the the smooth muscles, and the effect is that means it controls the seminal vesicle contractions and vas deferens contractions. I mentioned in the last class or somewhere about the ejaculation reflex. It governs or it regulates the heart activity. Heart activity in terms of rhythm generation, in terms of its force. It regulates the glandular activity, all the exocrine glands, the salivary gland, gastric glands, the pancreatic glands, the bile, intestinal glands, all are controlled by the autonomic nervous system. In addition, it also governs the some of those endocrine glands may not be direct but indirectly. Say for example, the pancreas. Pancreas is supplied by the vagus nerve, and vagus nerve supply the beta cells of the pancreas. So now beta cell activity is also monitored by the vagal inputs. So like that, a sort of a indirect activity, it governs the endocrine glands also. In other aspect, if you are looking at the blood supply to the endocrine gland is regulated by the autonomic nervous system, sympathetic system, and it limits the entry of light into the eye depending upon the situation. That means the pupillary reflexes. So these are broad functions. You can just think about, and you can add some more functions as you remember, as you come across. Okay, move on to the just I was talking about the definition of this thing. The autonomic nervous system is responsible for the homeostatic regulations of at unconscious level. Here is one of the example of the homeostatic regulation of blood pressure at unconscious level. Here I am trying to show you the baroreflex mechanism in the regulation of the blood pressure. We are not knowing what is the blood pressure within our blood vessels, but this blood pressure is being monitored by the receptors located in the carotid artery and the aortic arch, what are known as baroreceptors. And these mechanoreceptors are because of the stretch. When the blood pressure is high, the stretch that increases the activity of these mechanoreceptors, which in turn reach the medulla. This is the medulla here, the nucleus tractus solitarius. And once it reaches the nucleus tractus solitarius, it will send excitatory signal to the inhibitory pathway, because there is an increase in pressure and the pressure has to decrease. So this is the thing which descends down, or it gives a bulbospinal projections. That means from the medulla to the spinal cord, intermediolateral cells of the spinal cord, where sympathetic neurons are located. And these sympathetic neurons in turn activate the sympathetic nerves, which is either supplying the blood vessel or supplying the heart, or reach the adrenal medulla. So this is that means increase will decrease this activity and regulate blood pressure. One more thing is missing here in this particular diagram. The glutamatergic projection, which is coming to RVLM or CVLM, is the nucleus ambiguous, and this would also excite the nucleus ambiguous. Nucleus ambiguous is the dorsal motor nucleus of the vagus. So from this, the vagal output begins. This is the motor output to the vagus nerve, and vagus nerve supplies the heart. That means the action or activation of the vagus nerve decreases the activity of the heart. That is how this what I went to the baroreflex, because just I revised the baroreflex for your consideration. Now, effectors are now, this is a subconscious level, because we don't know what is the blood pressure in our artery, but this is at a subconscious level. That is how it homeostatically regulate our blood pressure. The effectors are controlled by the visceral reflexes, the way I mentioned, and these are they receive subconscious sensory signals. I mentioned about it from a visceral organ, enter the autonomic ganglia, the brainstem, or the hypothalamus, and in turn, subconscious reflex responses directly back to the visceral organ to control its activities. Here, the stretch reaching to the medulla, then it giving a inhibitory output or suppressing the sympathetic activity. That is the reflex. The efferent autonomic signals are transmitted through the sympathetic and or parasympathetic system. So that means here only sympathetic is shown, the parasympathetic I mentioned. So this is how the various visceral reflexes operate. It is not only, I have taken this as an example to show you how this visceral reflexes operate. This figure was taken from, it is taken from Genoug. Okay, now how the autonomic nervous system and the somatic nervous system are organized, or how it is different from the somatic motor system. Motor system. In the somatic motor system, we have the alpha motor neuron. This alpha motor neuron supplies the muscle. This is the muscle here. So that means a neuron is directly producing or making a contact with a muscle and producing the muscle contraction. That is one. In case of the autonomic nervous system, what happens? We have a neuron here. That means the neuron is located in the intermediolateral column of the spinal cord, and this neuron comes out, and that will make a ganglion, what we call it as a paravertebral chain of ganglion. That means a synapse, and that relays there. From here, the postganglionic fiber starts, and these postganglionic fibers reach to the target organs or target sites. Target sites may be smooth muscle, may be gland, may be cardiac muscle. So that means here it is a one neuron, and here you have another neuron which is trying to modulate or regulate this aspect, because these inputs are also coming back in some form. I will show you in subsequent slides. Okay, now this is a that means autonomic nervous system has a two neuron system. Here it is one neuron system. Of course, this is much more complicated in case of enteric system. In the enteric system, it is very complex, and so this is the autonomic nervous system has two major divisions, broadly two major divisions: sympathetic system and parasympathetic system. And these sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions, usually they act as one opposes the action of another. The parasympathetic and sympathetic, they are reciprocal. And this type of antagonism or opposing actions, these are not at the pharmacological receptors. That means the receptors which are acetylcholine receptors or adrenergic. It's not at the receptor. It is a sort of an antagonism which opposes the physiological actions. Say, for example, sympathetic produce more excitability, parasympathetic cools down. So like that, it is a physiological antagonist, or each one will be a physiological antagonist. Now, look here, what is the organization of the sympathetic and parasympathetic nerves? The parasympathetic nerves, let me consider the parasympathetic nerves now. It is they are present in those cranial nerves nucleus. The cranial nerves are third, seventh, 9th and 10th cranial nerve. These cranial, neurons in these nucleus of these cranial nerves is located, and these neurons reach to the ganglion or the junction. If I were to take about a vagus, vagus comes down and reaches the intestine. Here in the enteric plexus, they have the ganglion. So, and from here, the postganglionic fibers start. So that means we have a parasympathetic system. We have the preganglionic fiber and a ganglion. This ganglion is present in the almost in the viscera, and that is why I am trying to mix up here with the viscera. And the postganglionic fibers are very short. The postganglionic axons are very short. This is one aspect. And the transmitter secreted from the preganglionic fiber is acetylcholine. And this acetylcholine here also is the transmitter here in the postganglionic fiber. This is also acetylcholine. The acetylcholine secreted from the preganglionic nerve is different from the acetylcholine, or it is the same molecule. However, the receptors here are different. These are mostly the nicotinic acetylcholine receptors. That is why I have mentioned here acetylcholine, N for nicotine. Then on the viscera, the postganglionic fibers, they will make either a gland or a smooth muscle. These acetylcholine receptors are muscarinic receptors. These are M receptors, or muscarinic receptors. So they are different. This is a nicotinic receptor, and this is a muscarinic receptors. Now, let us come back with the sympathetic system. In the sympathetic system, the neurons are located in the intermediolateral horn cell of the spinal cord. Here it is in the brainstem and the spinal cord. Brainstem is a 3rd, 7th, 9th, and 10th cranial nerve, and the sacral parasympathetics. These are all the parasympathetic outputs. That is where these neurons are located. Whereas sympathetic fibers are exclusively in the spinal cord, especially limiting themselves to the thoracolumbar segments. That is why the sympathetic nervous system is known as a thoracolumbar outflow. The parasympathetic is known as a craniosacral outflow. That means cranial brainstem nuclei and the cranial nerve nuclei and the sacral segments. That is the craniosacral thoracolumbar. Now, in case of sympathetic fibers, the preganglionic fibers are shorter. And these are, that means they will make a paravertebral chain of ganglion. And from this ganglion, the postganglionic neurons start, and these postganglionic neurons, they will reach with the anterior horn cells or anterior root, and then they will reach the respective viscera, whatever the visceral organs they have to supply. These are postganglionic. So longer postganglionic axons, here longer preganglionic axons. The look here, the neurotransmitter is acetylcholine nicotinic type, or acetylcholine is same, but the receptors here are nicotinic type. Here also the same. That means at ganglion, either sympathetic or parasympathetic, the acetylcholine acts on the nicotinic receptors, because at ganglion the nicotinic receptors are expressed on this postsynaptic site. That means the action is excitation. They open up the nicotinic receptor is a iontophoretic receptor that binding of the acetylcholine opens up the cation channel or sodium channel. Now, so this one will be longer, and it will excite, and it will release norepinephrine and epinephrine. Only in an exception, that means only in one condition, where they secrete acetylcholine, that is the sweat glands. The nerves, the sweat glands are supplied by the sympathetic nerves, but they are cholinergic. Accepting that is a very exclusive component, accepting that it is primarily norepinephrine, and then also epinephrine, because they are all almost similar actions, these postganglionic fibers. Okay, now in case of certain exceptions, because the preganglionic fibers are longer in sympathetic nervous system, also we have the splanchnic nerves, which supply the adrenal medulla. Adrenal medulla is a endocrine organ situated in the adrenal gland, and this adrenal medulla receives the sympathetic input from the thoracic segments, and these sympathetic, they have a long preganglionic neurons, and they use the adrenal medulla as a ganglion, and adrenal medulla is rich with those enterochromaffin cells that secretes epinephrine or adrenaline. There is very less norepinephrine there, so that is in response to a call for the flight and fight response, where your adrenergic activity is highly increased. Here I broadly mention the organization of the autonomic nervous system. The main centers are located in the brain stem, that is the cranial nerve nuclei, and in the spinal cord. From the brain stem, you have the cranial nerves, 3rd, 7th, 9th, and 10th. They will be coming to the they will be acting as a parasympathetic and supplying the effectors. And in the effector, they make the postganglionic fibers. In case of the spinal cord, only the sacral segments, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th segment of the sacral vertebral column or sacral segments, they will be having what is that sacral parasympathetics. They will be producing the effect on the effector organs, especially these pelvic organs. Now, this is about the parasympathetic division. Then the sympathetic division is exclusively controlled by the thoracolumbar outflow. And this sympathetic division governs all the structures of the body. Whereas parasympathetic division, if you are looking at, it has been subdivided by the cranial nerves, 3, 7, and 9 and 11, 9 and 10. They are subdivided. So that means these brainstem and spinal cord have centers. This is the main center here. These have centers, and these centers either govern parasympathetic or sympathetic components. So in terms of sympathetic, it is only thoracolumbar outflow, and for the entire body. These two things are governed by hypothalamus. Hypothalamus in turn regulate both the parasympathetic and sympathetic activity through its input to the medullary descending tracts. In turn, they modify the medullary inputs to descending down and trying to influence the various centers. These are the centers here, either is the spinal cord or the cranial nerve nucleus. Now, hypothalamus in turn, if you are looking at hypothalamus in turn is governed by the limbic system, especially the amygdala. Amygdala is a part of the limbic system, which is an organ or a nervous tissue which govern our emotions. So these emotions, you have different type of emotions. Some are some emotions regarding the you become aggressive, in that adrenergic activity is more, or you cool down, or you are just depressed. So that means the parasympathetic activity is dominant, something like that. It is because of the amygdalar excitement. The limbic system governs the hypothalamus. Through the hypothalamus, it will govern all these brainstem and spinal cord activity. Now, this limbic system is being both sides. Is being regulated or influenced by the cingulate cortex, reticular system, the inputs coming from reticular system, inputs coming from cingulate cortex. And definitely this is whenever emotion is there, cingulate cortex has to be there. And sensory motor cortex, because if emotions were to be shown, either whatever to be shown, say for example, if one wants to run away, so that's a part of the emotion. So that means the motor cortex. So they receive inputs from the motor cortex and the sensory cortex. Even the occipital sensory means all the sensory modalities. So they are activated, they influence the limbic system. So then the prefrontal cortex, this is where, say for example, if there is a blast. So if that blast is a very small cracker-like sound, then prefrontal cortex says that it's no good, okay, no botheration. If it is heavy or a explosive blast, prefrontal cortex says that there is a danger, you get out or you try to take action, something like that. So that means a prefrontal cortex, olfactory cortex, the hippocampus, all these things influence this limbic system and hypothalamus. So that means overall the effectors are governed primarily by the brainstem and the spinal cord, and this brainstem and spinal cord via the craniosacral outflow, that is parasympathetic division, produce an effect, or via the thoracolumbar outflow, they will produce an effect. Say for example, I will take one simple example here. The parasympathetic effect on the heart is decrease the heart rate and decrease the contractility. Sympathetic effect on the heart is increase the heart rate and increase the contractility. So this is what I wanted to say. It is a sort of a physiological antagonism. It's nothing to do with, it does not oppose the sympathetic activity, but it will have its own effect which opposes the actions, oppose the actions. That is why it is physiological antagonist. Now coming back here, so now these brainstem and these things were governed by hypothalamus, because hypothalamus is the seat which receives inputs from various components from the limbic system, especially the amygdala. And amygdala governs hypothalamus, hypothalamus through the brainstem, altering these neurons or the centers, they will bring the action. This is a generalized plan of the autonomic nervous system. Now, coming back here, I have taken this diagram because always we feel confused with the white rami and the gray rami. So now here is the spinal cord, half of the spinal cord. This is the intermediolateral horn, or what is called a lateral horn. This lateral horn is bigger in thoracolumbar cords. Thoracolumbar cords will have the lateral horn is bigger. In case of the cervical and sacral segments, this is not there because there is no sympathetic these things. Now this is a lateral horn neuron. This is a sympathetic neuron. This neuron is coming here. This is the ventral root. You can just see that ventral root. This comes here, and once it comes here, and it reaches the ganglion. This is a ganglion. This is the paravertebral ganglion. So this comes to the ganglion and relays into the ganglion. This comes to the ganglion through a fascicle or a bundle. This is called white ramus. White ramus. So that means a white. This is one, because this is a preganglionic. It's a myelinated, thinly myelinated. Then This after making a synapse, the post-ganglionic fibers, this is the paravertebral chain. The post-ganglionic fibers go through the gray ramus. This is a gray ramus, the one which contains this blue, and this one will join the anterior horn cells. They go to the respective neurons. That's one aspect. The second aspect, some of the fibers, because not all the there are certain because vertebral chains do not cover all the segments. Certain segments are missed, especially the celiac ganglion and the mesenteric ganglion, and even the adrenal medulla. So they will be supplied by the nerve. Say, for example, they are reached to the celiac ganglion, mesenteric ganglion, and the plexuses. These are called a perivertebral ganglion, and these perivertebral ganglion, they will be supplied by these and they will be activated. So here I made, this is a white rami. That means this is the thing which is coming from the preganglionic fiber reaching the paravertebral chain. This is the white rami, and it makes a post-ganglion synapse here. Post-ganglionic fibers goes through the gray rami and goes through the ventral horn and join the spinal nerves, and then reach the target viscera, wherever whether it is a blood vessel or a visceral smooth muscle or a glands or sweat glands or piloerector muscle, or wherever it has to go, it will go. Now the same thing here, I have just because this is, I have taken it from Genang, and look here, this is more complex diagram, because first I started with a simplified diagram because it's a more complex diagram you have. So now what is happening here? This red one is your sympathetic from the intermediolateral horn from the sympathetic. It's coming here, okay? It's coming here, and this one will reach. This is the white ramus. This is the white ramus. It will reach the paravertebral chain. This is the paravertebral chain, and make a synaptic contact. Okay, this is the synapse here. The postganglionic fibers goes through the gray ramus and out. Okay, now this, whatever it has made a synapse here, and it will also have a synaptic contact with the next segment, because you have different segments operated, because it's not only restricted to a particular segment. So the entire paravertebral chain is intercommunicated. That's what this diagram shows. Then second, the one fibers which are not synapsed, especially those who are supplying to this prevertebral ganglion. Prevertebral ganglion, that is a mesenteric ganglion or celiac ganglion or to the adrenal medulla. So now they reach there and they make synapse, and then after that there is a postganglionic fibers arise. So that is about the efferent pathway. Now, if this is the IML output arrives at white rami, it arrives at white rami, reaches the vertebral ganglion. This is the vertebral paravertebral ganglion. Make a synaptic contact. Then postsynaptic or postganglionic fiber pass through the gray rami, and join the spinal nerves in the ventral root and reach the target viscera. Okay. Whereas this is as far as the output of the intermediolateral cell. Now the afferents, the inputs to this spinal cord, you can just see here. These are some visceral receptors, because what we are considering, if there is a stretch of the intestine, there is a stretch of the receptor and a stretch, then they are received by these sympathetic afferents, these visceral receptors, and they reach to this ganglion here. This is just this is a celiac ganglion here. So they make a synaptic contact, and this synaptic contact is something as it is going, it's a collateral one. Check the excitability or whatever. Now it makes a synaptic contact there. the visceral output. This is the sensory thing on afferent influence, the stretch or a colicky pain or the spasm of the smooth muscle. This is being detected. This is the mechanical one, and it reaches to the paravertebral chain. This is a paravertebral chain. And then what happens here? This is the white ramus. Through the white ramus, it enters the what is this posterior root. This is a posterior root, and once it enters the posterior root, it enters the dorsal. This is the dorsal root, and then makes a synaptic contact with this neuron, intermediate lateral neuron. At the same time, it will also have a synaptic contact with the pain producing pain carrying information, that is the spinothalamic tract. So that means there is a convergence. They will also activate these things. That is why if you have a pain or pain is produced, suppose if I'm considering it from the heart, so if the heart is there, so then the heart is supplied by the superior cervical ganglion or stellate ganglion, and stellate ganglion is supplying the just the areas of the muscles, deltoid or the arm, C7 or C8 level, and that is why what happens, the spinothalamic tract here, that will be converging, and you will get what is called a referred pain. So now I read this thing. Afferents from viscera reach prevertebral ganglion or may directly reach the paravertebral chain. Okay, travel to paravertebral ganglion here. This is, but there is no synapse. It will just ascend to enter the DRG, dorsal root ganglion, and reach the spinal gray matter. This is the spinal gray matter, and they converge on the projecting neuron of the spinothalamic tract. This is a projecting neuron of the spinothalamic tract. This ascend up, and that will be processing for the pain pathway. And collateral is given to the intermediolateral. It is to give a check for the or restrict the output. Now this is about the sympathetic division. You can just see that the sympathetic division, you start from eye there. So the pupillary muscles, what happens, it will produce the pupillary dilatation, the activation of the sympathetic system. This supplies the eye, especially the ciliary muscle or the muscles which are constrictor papillae or dilator papillae, and it will activate the dilator papillae. So that means that will dilate the pupil, and it will supply the heart for rate and force. It will supply the bronchi, especially the terminal bronchioles, the smooth muscles, they will go into spasm. So this will supply the bronchi, the respiratory bronchioles or terminal bronchioles. Then it will supply the celiac ganglion. The celiac ganglion in turn supply it to all viscera. Say for example, stomach, the intestine, the adrenal medulla, because this adrenal medulla is you are getting a direct preganglionic fiber. Then we have a kidney, ureter, and this supply goes up to the part everywhere. So you can just see that all through the anal canal, up to the anal canal, it supplies. So that means all parts of the entire viscera. Then you have a lower segments here, L1 and L5. So that is the hypogastric plexus, and this one is trying to maintain the urinary bladder, the muscles of the urinary bladder, and the sphincters and the trigone. So they are managed, and to a certain extent, they will also have certain other pelvic organs, especially the seminal vesicle and vas deferens. They will produce a contraction. It is not shown here. That is what. On this side, fibers supply the piloerector muscle. The piloerector is a muscle that makes that the hair cells to project. That means erection of the hair. Piloerector is the erection of the hair. Then also it will supply the sweat gland, and this one is a cholinergic fiber. Then we have this, it will supply the blood vessels of all the entire body, that is supplied by this thing. Now these dotted lines indicate the rami communicants. So that means the black dashed lines represent the postganglionic fibers of the gray rami nerves from sympathetic chains into the spinal nerves along with the ventral root for distribution to the viscera. That's what this diagram is. Now coming back to the parasympathetic system, I mentioned about parasympathetic system. We have a third cranial nerve, that ciliary ganglion, ciliary muscles of the eye, the sphincter pupillae, and sphenopalatine ganglion. These are the things where this will supply third cranial nerve. That means the activation of the third cranial nerve produces the constriction of the pupil. Activation of the sympathetic system produces a dilatation. That is third cranial nerve. Then that will be necessary for ciliary muscle is necessary for accommodation of the eye. We have this seventh cranial nerve that governs these lacrimal gland, nasal gland, and submandibular gland. Parotid glands are from the ninth cranial nerve, and seventh govern these submandibular and sublingual glands. Now comes the ninth cranial nerve. Ninth cranial nerve have a greater supply. All the blood vessels, or that means they receive inputs, and because the ninth cranial nerve receives the baroreceptor inputs, the chemoreceptor inputs, that is not mentioned here. But here they will give it to, these are efferent pathways, they will give it to parotid gland and the parotid gland secretion. Then the supply to the heart, especially the pacemakers, the ACA node and the AV node. This is the ACA node, AV node. Then they will, the vagus, this is the vagus nerve supplied to the heart. The bronchi also it supplies, the viscera, thoracic viscera. Then it will supply to the entire intestinal tract, the esophagus, down to the intestinal tract, up to this level, up to the transverse colon, Then after the transverse colon, it is taken up by the sacral segment. These are the sacral segments. Sacral segments 2, 3, 4. They will be, this will be known as a nervi irrigentis, or the sacral nerve, and this sacral nerve supply the colon, the pelvic organs, the urinary bladder, ureter, and even the seminal vesicle and vas deferens. This is about the parasympathetic component. So now you can just see that this governs the anal sphincter here. It governs even the detrusor muscle, and that means that governs the sphincter vesicae, or the gallbladder sphincter. So they are three important structures in the pelvic area. The sphincter vesicae there, and then this anal sphincter, and they supply the penile corpora cavernosa. There it produces a erection of the penis. That is not shown there. So these aspects will be with the sacral parasympathetics. So involve cranial nerves, oculomotor, facial, glossopharyngeal, and vagus. Okay, now what is enteric nervous system? It is the third division of the autonomic nervous system, and it has an enormous number of neurons, as large as the neurons present in the entire spinal cord or in the brain. That is why it is called mini brain, because these nervous system, the neurons present in the intestine tract, they have receptors, They detect the chemical composition, thermal and the mechanical, and then they would perform many other functions at a local level, at a even controlled to an extent by the autonomic system. So it has organized neural plexuses in the wall of the entire digestive tract. These neural plexuses, either a myenteric plexus in between circular and longitudinal smooth muscles, or the mucosal and the submucosal plexuses below the mucosa. Then the parasympathetic and sympathetic nerves connect to these myenteric and these things. The parasympathetic are the main ones. The sympathetic one will modulate the parasympathetic activity. The enteric nervous system can be autonomous. It is said that they can, even without the nerve supply, they can perform their functions, but they for normal digestive functions require the coordination or integration by the autonomic nervous system. Here I am showing the myenteric plexus. This myenteric plexus I mentioned located between the longitudinal and circular layers of the muscle. This is the mucosal layer of the intestine, and in this is the circular smooth muscle. Between this mucosal layer and the circular smooth muscle, we have this is a submucosal plexus. Submucosal located between the circular muscle and the mucosa. Circular muscle and the mucosa, we have the submucosal plexus. This is submucosal plexus. You can just see that plexus is very simplified, very simplified there. It's more complex and more number of neurons, or you have a n number of infinite number of neurons there. So now each one, if you are looking at, they are secreting the substance P, then norepinephrine, because norepinephrine coming from there. Then we have acetylcholinergic. So you have nitrogen neurons. We have so many other type of neurotransmitters are there. Now then we have this is circular muscles. In this circular muscle, so we have these neurons reaching and the look here, the one point I want to say, this is the parasympathetic preganglionic nerve fibers. It's reaching here, and once it reaches here, it makes a synapse. Here the ganglion is formed. This is the postganglionic fiber. I want to impress. This is the vagus. If you are thinking, vagus is there, 10th cranial nerve nucleus in the medulla, and from the medulla it is reaching up to here, up to preganglionic, and it is only postganglionic. So now this is the second part. What is the function of this submucosal plexus? It senses the contents of the lumen. Primarily, it is to sense the contents of the neuron. This what is there, what is here in the below the lumen, because here it is the lumen. So contents of the lumen, and regulates the blood flow and epithelial function. So that means epithelial function and blood flow means if it were to absorb more, or if it were to secrete more, and that's activated. Now come back with the myenteric plexus. Myenteric plexus is, this is MP, is a myenteric plexus between the circular muscle and the longitudinal muscle. And this myenteric plexus is predominantly, it has a large number of parasympathetic preganglionic fibers. So they make the relay here. These are the neurons. The postganglionic will be there. They will either project to the submucosal plexus or project to the circular and longitudinal muscles. In addition, they have been regulated by a number of other neurons. I have taken another diagram here. Just to start, this is the mucosa. This is submucosal plexus. Submucosal plexus. Here we have only made 2 neurons there, and this submucosal plexuses, they will detect this distension, the chemical composition, and they have the neurotransmitters, acetylcholine, nitric oxide, and VIP. Here they come, we have cholinergic neurons. The cholinergic neurons, these are ascending excitatory motor neurons. These cholinergic neurons with either ACH and substance P, this will produce the contraction. At the same time, because these are reciprocally innervated, so that is it is innervated with the another group of nerve which is relaxing. This is contracting and this is relaxing. If it were to propel from one side, the other side has to relax. So when it contracts, this simultaneously it will activate inhibitory neuron. This is the inhibitory neuron, and this inhibitory neuron secretes nitric oxide, VIP, NP neuropeptide Y, and purinergic or ATP. So they produce the relaxation so that a forward movement, oral to anal, propulsion takes place. So that is one part. And we have a networking here, networking of the neurons that is there in the enteric nervous system. So now the longitudinal muscles, they are supplied. Again, I mentioned these longitudinal muscles and circular muscles are supplied by these things. And these are being modulated by the cholinergic inputs and coming from the vagus. Vagus makes a synaptic contact here, and they will also supply and add to the contractions. And at the same time, the cholinergic inputs are modulated by the adrenergic. Say, for example, if you go back here, if you see here, acetylcholine. This is acetylcholinergic neuron, and this would be inhibited by the norepinergic neurons. Now, briefly, I read sensory neurons innervate, and it will sense all the mechanical, thermal, the temperature here, osmotic, because if there is a osmosis or a large amount of the food particles which are not absorbed or to be absorbed, and then or a chemical receptors, so whatever the type of the chemicals. Then we have a motor neurons control motility, secretion, and absorption. The motor neurons, they will control these activities. Interneurons, they try to integrate that feedback. It's a part of the nervous system that is regulated at a unconscious or subconscious level, all the homeostatic functions of the body. It is divided into sympathetic and parasympathetic compartments, and also include the enteric nervous system. It has, the autonomic nervous system has centers in the brainstem and spinal cord. I have explained the brainstem, the craniosacral and thoracolumbar, regulated by the hypothalamus, amygdala, cingulate cortex, the prefrontal cortex, the hippocampus, and other areas of the brain. Sympathetic and parasympathetic system have a two neuron system, the efferent systems, two neuron systems with a synapse. The preganglionic fibers secrete acetylcholine, which act on the nicotinic receptors on the postsynaptic membrane and produce the action. The postganglionic parasympathetic is acetylcholine, but that involves the muscarinic receptor. Whereas the sympathetic postganglionic sympathetic fiber secretes epinephrine and norepinephrine. The ganglion in parasympathetic system is located in the viscera. You just saw that. And in case of sympathetic division, it is located in the para and the perivertebral chain. The parasympathetic preganglionic nerve is longer, and the postganglionic fiber is shorter, whereas the sympathetic preganglionic fiber is shorter and postganglionic is longer. So now, keywords for this topic as an assignment. You can take these topics as a short note question for each of you. The preganglionic fibers, the postganglionic fibers, the enteric nervous system, the gray rami and white rami communicants, parasympathetic nerve fibers, sympathetic nerve fibers, myenteric plexus, submucosal plexus, components of the autonomic nervous system, autonomic versus somatic efferents, the parasympathetic versus sympathetic nerve fibers. So these are the topics of interest as a short note for you people. Now, in the next class, I will take with the sympathetic nervous system in a detailed manner. Reference books, the Candle's Neuroscience, Guyton's textbook of Physiology, and the Ganong's textbook of Physiology. Okay, thank you very much.